Hello, hello, hello. I am so excited that you are here joining me today for this very special webinar on eco-sexuality, the eros of our ancestors. We have a lot of information to cover and I talk a lot, so let's go ahead and dive right in. I am going to share my screen. Come over here. Okay. So, eco-sexuality, the eros of our ancestors. If you don't know me, my name is Hannah Livingood. That is my real last name. I'm a sexologist, a clinical herbalist, a doula, and a professional hedonist, as I like to say. My background is in education. I was a wilderness guide for 8 years, and I'd like to say I was a pretty messy motherfucker. I'll talk a little bit more about my personal journey with eco-sexuality in a bit, but these are just a few things about me. Real quick, I'd love to give acknowledgements to all of my teachers, including the water, the air, the sun, and the earth. And these are some of my deepest teachers. Also, you can see here is a screenshot of Charleston, South Carolina. This is where I'm coming to you from. But here, this is a map of the unceded territory and the Native peoples who lived here well before me. I am not Native American, but these also are the ancestors of this land. And so it is important to me to give an acknowledgement to the people who came here before, who laid the path for me to walk. You'll also see a list here of my teachers. I couldn't list them all, but these are some of the people that I've worked with most closely and that I love very dearly. There's so many more who can be listed, but it is important to me to give these acknowledgements because I deeply value who I've become, and all of these things, places, and people have played a large part in who I am today and the presentation that I'm going to share with you now. So my intention for this experience together is just to lay a foundation to understand the historical significance of where we have come from in our sex and sexual expression, and then also begin to rework our mindset around that foundation. So maybe questioning where things have come from, why they have been a part of us, and just provide a few examples of what could be possible with a new frame of mind. Let's just take a moment to ground down into the space. If you are driving or walking or multitasking, I invite you just to be more intentional with your movement at this time. And if you have the capacity to soften your eyes or close your eyes, maybe you do that. And just begin to tune into your space, to your body in space. Noticing how much space you take up in space. Be allowing gravity to really be felt by you in this moment. Like a wave washing over you. the weight of gravity pushing you further into space that you are in. Be feeling the breath move in and out of your belly. Noticing how the addition of breath changes the space you take up in space. Just grounding into our own space, time, dimension, and deepening the breath, and allowing an audible exhale, again, inhaling into the nose, filling up and letting go. One more time at your own pace, inhaling in through your nose. With an exhale, allowing the sounds and the deep breaths to bring you back into your room, to your car, into this portal of education and enlightenment. Hoping you felt a little shift, a little more grounded here together. So a little more background on myself and the work that I do. I grew up in a very rural area and spent most of my time playing outside with my brother in the forest and by the creek. I grew up with two parents who love the outdoors and would spend a lot of time hiking and canoeing and kayaking and camping in and around the Appalachia. And so nature was a safe place for me, often safer than many people that I met. And it was a place of security and nourishment. And I recall going to the creek behind my house when tough times would hit, like when my dog passed away or when my family was fighting. And as I grew older, this didn't change. In high school, I ended up being a part of a series of sexual abuses were done to me, and also perpetuated my pain through a very dysfunctional sexual behavior and also lots of substances. I didn't feel like I could tell anybody about the experiences I was having and the feelings that I felt, and I continuously returned to the forest to be my source of rescue, to be my connection to spirit, to feel all right, like something was going to be okay in the world. As I went into college, my use of substances and the use of sexuality was continued to exasperate, and I took many sexual partners, explored very openly with my sexuality, and also very openly with substances. I think risky behavior begets risky behavior. So These things tended to fuel one another. And as much as I was searching for understanding within my use of sex and substances, it felt so disconnected and empty for me. I couldn't figure out how to separate my habits from my desires because they weren't aligned. And over time, I went on my spiritual journey, and the dog is excited. But over time, I deepened into my spiritual practice and explored explored herbalism. I explored religion, and I explored my internal landscape. And these things were all contributing to asking deeper questions of myself and of my journey. And they helped me to move from dysfunction into something that felt deeply connected and deeply aligned. The experience that I felt was dysfunctional, and what I term as dysfunctionality is something that feels unaligned from our desires. So that to me looked like desiring something that was really deep and rich and connected and fulfilling. But no matter where I looked and what I did, it felt the opposite. So this to me is dysfunction, when our desires are not in alignment with what our habits or experience is. And so this is the work that I set out to do, not only with myself, but with others, is to move us from dysfunctionality into something that is deeply connected, particularly in our sensing life, in our sensual life. And we're going to explore this concept of sensuality and what I mean by that as we move forward. But yeah, this is a deep part of what I do. And Earth and the journey of Earth was so pivotal to that. I remember sitting at a river on this rock that was my favorite rock at the river, and being in the sun and feeling so lost and hopeless, and staring out at the world. I had been doing so much religious study and spiritual discovery, and the concept in my head was that I loved nature so much, and that God has made nature in God's own reflection. And this can be goddess, universe, source, whatever you want to, whatever you want to call it. And then the passage from the Bible came that we are made in God's own reflection. And I thought, well, if I can see God outside myself here in nature, I can see this beauty, I can see how worthy this world is, then I am but a reflection of that. And this helped me to get back into my self-worth and step into my own power, my own confidence, and feel more in tune with myself so that I could go out into the world and do the same. So I like to say that I found my soul in the soil, because it really was seeing this outside myself that allowed me to conceptualize it for my own internal landscape. And I think sometimes doing self-work is so hard, and doing work with other humans can be so hard because there's all this stigma, there's all this biases, there's all these layers that we have to get through with the self. And that's why I love this concept of eco-sexuality, because nature is another divine being that is made in our image, and we are made in nature's image. And it doesn't come with the same biases or stigmas that other humans do, and that we do as our own individual selves, conceptualizing ourselves. So this is my experience, how I got here. And at the time, this was a when I started to awaken to my own self-worth. I mean, I was in such a love affair with nature that I was going out there every single day. I couldn't breathe, it felt like, without going to the river, without going to the forest, without spending some time outside, because it really was where I reconnected to myself. And I would, being a very sexual being in this hyperactive state of sexuality, would go out and connecting with people didn't feel aligned at the time, even though I was partaking in a behavior in other behavior. But like going into the forest or going to the river and masturbating and feeling the sun on my skin and feeling the breeze on my body, I felt alive. I felt awakened. And there was something amidst all of this where I began to see Earth as a lover. And this really shifted my relationship to Earth, because I had always heard the concept of as Earth as mother. And this is like really big in the environmentalist movement. Earth is mother. And I don't love this, because mothers are thought to be self-sacrificing. A child will extract the milk and the honey and the life force from a mother, and a mother is expected to give all she can to make sure that her young live and thrive in the world. And shifting the concept of Mother Earth to Lover Earth for me made me realize that Earth is in a reciprocal relationship with us. And just like in any relationship, if I treat my lover poorly, my lover has the complete autonomy to leave. And this really shifted the way that I was looking at environmentalism and climate change and activism as a whole. And I really began to deepen into the curiosity of like where this thought process could take me. I began exploring herbalism through the wilderness guiding that I was doing, and continued deepening my education through university. After that, I graduated and started studying sexology at the Institute of Sex Education and Enlightenment. And that is where I first heard about eco-sexuality. But before we dive deeper into eco-sexuality, I really want to lay a historical foundation of where we have come from and why eco-sexuality is the lens that can change our whole perspective, not only of our sexual experience, but of our lives. So this is going to be a lot of information. But before we get into all of that, I want to talk about the way that we view sex. So this is going to be something that we come back to later. And this is an exercise for you to hopefully get something out of this besides just information. So I've got a couple questions for you if you want to journal, if you have a pen and paper nearby, or if you want to just kind of like make some notes in your phone, or maybe you can just like make a mental note. My brain is always working like a million miles a second, so I always forget, but you do you, boo. But I want you to drop in for a second, and this is kind of going to be stream of consciousness. So what I mean by that is just whatever comes up first, just write it down. Don't question it. Don't rethink it. Just put it on paper and and move on. So the first question I have for you is, what is sex? What is sex? I want you to think about, what is sex for? What is sex for? finally, who is sex for? We should think about who is sex for. And these questions are meant to be a bit vague, because I don't want anything super specific. I just want you to be thinking, what is sex? What is sex for? Who is sex for? Okay. All right. Now that we've got that in our mind, we're going to be shifting gears a little bit and thinking about some of the history that got us to where we are. So let's time travel. We just time traveled, and now we are in ancient history. Okay, and in ancient history, sex is powerful. There were priests and priestesses of sacred rites, just like there are today in many religious orders. You might see priests more than you see priestesses, but they exist. And when I think of these terms in a modern context, I think of somebody who is carrying the wisdom and tradition of religion down through time, acting as a conduit for source, God, higher power, to us here on earth, kind of the lay people, as you will, is kind of what I imagine as a modern priest or priestess. And in ancient times, this is not too far from the same context. They were guardians of ancient knowledge, sacred tradition, and the mystical realms. And there was a lot more magic and ceremony involved in the priesthood than I think there is today, even though we still see kind of threads of that. For example, baptism in Christianity is a ceremony and kind of this mystical rite of passage. But in ancient times, there was more magic, more alchemy happening through the priesthood. And not only were the priests and priestesses carrying sacred knowledge of religion, of source energy, and of what is magic, but also of sex and sexuality, because to them, sex was seen as a part of spiritual, a part of the spiritual connection. One example of a priesthood is the serpent priestesses of ancient Egypt. The serpent priestesses of ancient Egypt were called whores, H-O-R, and this meant the beloved one, and is probably the root of where we get our term whore today. But the serpent priestesses were blood magic, sex magic priestesses of ancient Egypt who helped to connect people to their own sacred power of sex and spirit. And so through this, we see that sex is a life-giving force. It is a power. And you think of one potential outcome of sex is life. So it is creation incarnate. It is the act of creation itself. And therefore, it cannot be separate from spirit. I love this quote from the Kama Sutra. It says, "Thus a man practicing Dharma, Artha, and Kama enjoys happiness both in this world and the world to come." And this is from an ancient Indian text, the Kama Sutra. And Dharma is kind of purpose or righteousness. Artha is prosperity. Kama is love. And there's one that's missing here. A key principle is moksha, and that is liberation. So through these four qualities of liberation, prosperity, righteousness, and love, they believed that you can live a beautiful, fulfilling life. And so love, sex, and sexuality being a part of their definition of love was key to a full expression of self. There are, here's a list of energies of sex. and sexuality, and not only sex, but in creation. All things exist in this feminine and masculine, this yin and this yang. I don't want to dive too far into this. This is certainly a deep creek that we could paddle down, but I'm going to resist. And what I really want you to see here is that the feminine is innately a creative, intuitive, flowing energy, and it is deeply connected to nature. Whereas the masculine energy is something that's more intellectual, it is structured, it is stable, it is logical, and it's connected to culture. So the culture that we build around us. And I think masculine and feminine are a bit limiting in their in our language. So I don't love to use masculine and feminine, but there you will hear this rhetoric not only used by me, but many people in the spiritual realm and in the sex industry. But you cannot separate the masculine from the feminine. For example, I may present as a very feminine body, but I have masculine qualities of intellect and competitiveness. And I love being active, like I'm a super active being. Even as a masculine embodied individual, you may have qualities of the feminine within you. More than likely you do, or you have repressed them. And this means that you are emotional and creative and receptive, and you can have sympathy and passion drives action. So you can't have one without the other. And this is so all I think I want to say about that, but more just to show that the priestesshood, you'll see more sex priestesses than you will hear about sex priests. And that is because sex was kind of denoted to be a very feminine power. So these are examples of ancient texts from India, China, and Japan. You can see that we have the Vedas, later the Kama Sutras, which describe sex as a science and a spiritual endeavor. In China, the I Ching, which is the book of changes, describes heaven as being as having intercourse with the earth to birth all of creation. And it's very explicit in the I Ching about this sexual act between heaven and earth. Then we have this text, the tale. Then we have the tale of Zhengzhi, which is known to be one of the first novels of the first written novels. And it gives us a story of how sexuality was seen as part of the culture in Japan, and so much so that it is just innate in culture itself, just as much as music and art. So these are some examples of how culture was seeing, different cultures were seeing sex and sexuality. And what I really gain from these texts is that sex is not inherently bad, that sex is a part of life. They saw it as a valuable endeavor. And this is just one context, but we're going to layer on another context of power. So we were hunter-gatherers living very closely with the earth. We were of the earth. We were not separate from earth. And when we discovered the technology of agriculture, we began to shift into agrarian societies. Now, when we shifted into these more agrarian societies, we needed to have lands that we cultivated, and we moved around less. So then there became this idea of ownership, because land and surplus food became central to power and wealth. So you needed to be able to own these resources. And the necessity to control resources also led to the control of women, and not just women, but of sex in general, because it is a power. So you can see there's already these ties between land as a resource, sex as a resource, food and animals as resources, because and how the eco-sexuality begins to get woven in here. So anything that can provide power began to be coupled with this idea of ownership. And this is when we see the first signs of patriarchy, which we can find in written texts such as the tablets of the Sumerian city Uruk. And this was over 5,000 years ago, so a very long time ago. In 1861, we see one of the first scholars, Johann Boschap Finn, write about the ancient societies of motherhood and matriarchy. This is super interesting for the time, given the context of what was happening in the 1800s. But he was one of the first to inquire about how these societies, these ancient societies, wove in resources, and how motherhood and sexuality became the source of human society, religion, and how males began to enforce monogamy as an exercise in control over resources. And so this is really interesting, right? We're getting these concepts of beautiful ancient texts like the I Ching and the Vedas, coupled with what is actually happening in society at the time is struggling for power. So these spiritual and religious texts, these philosophical texts talking about how sex is actually this beautiful experience, connection to source, while society is experiencing something that looks a bit different. And you can really see this dichotomy of struggle in the Greek and Roman cultures, I think, very well, also because we have an immense written record from these times. But there's this idea of sexual liberation, for example, like homosexuality, pedophilia, things like this. They were not looked down upon. It was just very normal. But there's also this dynamic of sexual repression where women are being raped, and there is a lack of autonomy for wives. So there's this like really interesting power struggle. And then, yeah, there's an interesting power struggle, but we're not saying that sex is inherently bad. But then in 1415, we see the rise of Christianity as the Roman Empire declared that Christianity was going to be its state religion. And Christianity has this idea embedded within that sex is actually inherently bad. It's part of the devil. And before this, we were working with religions that were pantheistic and worshipped many different aspects of life. So here we see the consolidation of spirit into one God, one source, right and wrong, very black and white. Where before there was a lot of gray area, there's a lot of liminality in the ways that we could experience life. So our ancestors were shifted into a mindset that began to repress sexuality. Sorry, not even just repress it, but began to demonize it with the stories that were told in the Abrahamic religions. And then we see the impact of the patriarchy on reproductive rights, gender inequality, stereotypes and objectification, gender-based violence, all of these things beginning in ancient civilization has continued up until now. And I don't want to, this is not necessarily a criticism of men. That is not what this is an exercise on. More so that I want to emphasize how we have gotten here. I believe the men that are living in this day and age that we are on earth right now, these men did not choose this path. It has been chosen for us. And we can make different choices. We can make better choices. But I want you to know that not only does this affect women, but here I'm truly also advocating for men, because men are affected as well. It also, patriarchy shifts what their roles are in society. It shifts the way that they are objectified and stereotyped. It affects the way that they are, that violence is committed against them. And this is extremely nuanced and deserves a lot more conversation. But the patriarchy has taught us to disassociate ourselves, to separate ourselves from all of these aspects of life. And it affects women as well as men. So moving into a little bit more modern history instead of ancient times, we're looking at some aspects of public health. And these, I'm highlighting two scenarios here just to exemplify how the patriarchy has embedded itself in our sexual experience. James Marion Sims, for example, he's known as the father of gynecology. James Marion Sims is the father of gynecology, and he operated on enslaved women without anesthesia. So this would never fly today. He was revered at this time for being such an amazing surgeon and all of his discoveries, but at what cost? And so the field of gynecology, the field of sexology, and many other modern scholars have criticized James Marion Sims for the way that he went about discovering many of his of the procedures that are life-saving and have saved lives today. But this is that layer of questioning of who gets to decide who has rights and who doesn't have rights. And this is part of the ownership that Sims thought he could purchase these women and perform atrocities to their bodies without their consent, because they did not have consent because they were owned. Another example of this is the Tuckasegee syphilis study. And this is actually a study that was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Services. So this is a government, this is a government agency. And they partnered with the Tuskegee University, which is mostly an all-Black university at the time. And they were studying the effects of syphilis on the body. And they told 600 men that they were going to receive medical care, and they didn't receive any medical care. The study carried on from 6 months to 40 years, allowing these people to suffer from syphilis without providing any medical treatment. And this was pretty recently. This is in 1930 and carried on 40 years. So up until the late 1900s. This is pretty recently. And so this is just another example, not only of how the patriarchy has colonized our bodies, women's bodies, and I think this is an important conversation, and I'm going to keep emphasizing the work that I do, women and women's well-being, but I also want to recognize that men are also being colonized. They are also under siege in this war against ownership and power. So this is a history of sexuality in the West. There is a lot here. what I really want to emphasize mostly is that throughout the 16 and 1700s, even up through the 1800s, there was a lot of technology being built around sex and sexuality. So the creation of condoms and diaphragms. Also the in sorry, just lost my thought. But so there was the creation of contraception, not only in condoms and diaphragm, but also in birth control. And these were pretty big strides, even not even in the technology per se, but I think society as a whole, we were beginning to see a lot more rhetoric around sex as not evil and sex as something that was more widely accepted. Certainly, there were instances in society where there was backlash against these progressive beliefs. But in the 1980s, there was a outbreak of HIV and AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, and this sadly did a lot to stigmatize sexuality and re-solidify that sex was evil. So I feel like we really went backwards a lot in our thought and has contributed to where we are now in our 21st century with things like Roe versus Wade. And I'm not here to argue against what is right and wrong for any individual. I respect all of your ideologies, but I do believe in autonomy for each person. And that is something that we lack in a society of ownership. Okay, wow, we did a lot. Take a breath, take a breather. We just went through a lot of information. And now I want to get into eco-sexuality more specifically as a solution to these perspectives that we've held on sex and sexuality thus far. Okay, all right, so thinking about eco-sexuality as a solution to our dysfunction, not only as an individual, but as a society. Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle were the first to coin the term eco-sexuality, and they wrote the Eco-Sex Manifesto in 2016. So this is an excerpt I would love to read to you. It says, "We make love with the earth. We are aquaphiles, terraphiles, pyrophiles, aerophiles. We shamelessly hug trees, massage the earth with our feet, and talk erotically to plants. We are skinny dippers, sun worshippers, and stargazers. We caress rocks, are pleasured by waterfalls, and admire the earth's curves often. We make love to the earth with our senses. We celebrate our e-spots, and we are very, very dirty." So I love this so much because it is exactly how I felt. Remember that story of me pleasuring myself and gaining my own self-worth alongside the river and the forests and the trees and the soil and all of its inhabitants. And this really put words to my understanding of self. And it became a sexual orientation for me, just like you might be heterosexual or homosexual or bisexual. I'm an ecosexual. And not only did I feel like this really resonated with the way that I expressed my sexuality, but also it really beckons into a new, more connected sense of living. Ecosexuality is many things. And one of the things that it asks us most is to look at the way that we have been colonized and to begin the work of decolonization. Colonization is invasion. So we hear this a lot about the way that people have come over from Europe or other areas and colonized the Americas, set up their own settlements and lived here as if they owned the land. And this is absolutely one form of colonization. I also would like to mention that there is a colonization that happened alongside the actual physical colonization of the land, but the colonization of the idea of land. So what land meant, what good land was, and what it was used for. So at one point, all land was wild. And then when we found ownership and began to colonize land, we began to see land as productive, what is civilized, and we began to see us separate from what is wild. Human no longer was something of nature, it was separate from nature. So the land became something that needed to be productive in order to be of value. So land such as, I think of the marshland, which is just really close to my home, or the desert, these places that can't actually be farmed were seen as wild land and unsuitable land. There's also the colonization of the physical aspect of our body, our human landscape. And these, again, are examples from James Marion Sims and the syphilis study, but there are so many examples about how the body has been colonized. Slavery in and of itself is a colonization. I think of different privileges that we receive for being a certain way. For example, one that I experience is pretty privilege. You know, I get privilege from looking a certain way or behaving a certain way, but it also is a part of the colonizer that beauty acts or looks a certain way. And then there's also the colonization of wisdom, indigenous knowledge and religion, mysticism, and magical practices. So in herbalism, for example, it was believed that when we were more in tune with the land, when there was less civilization, when there was less technology, when we were in our hunter-gatherer era, the people, particularly the shamans and the mystics, had such an attunement to the land around them that they could speak to the plants and the animals. And you see this a lot in indigenous stories about, you know, like bird people or fox people. And they are beings as well as are we. And so there was a communication that was had with these beings, and it was believed that the first wisdom from our first knowledge of herbal wisdom was told to the shaman from the plants. And this is what you can use me for, and this is how you can use me, and this is how we want to be used. And now the knowledge that we have in herbalism is a very cut and dry. Use this plant for this, use A for B, instead of getting to know the plant in its fullest expression. So again, utilizing the productivity, the ownership, and eco-sexuality asks us to really look at the ways in which we contribute, we perpetuate colonization, the ways that we gain privilege from colonization or don't gain privilege from colonization, and reworking this. And this here you can see at the top of this circle is a kudzu leaf. And I think of colonization like kudzu. It is something that's very invasive, but there are many species of plants in the world that get brought over to a different land and can live in that landscape alongside the other native plants. And this is called mutualism. So going from a colonized mindset to a mutual mindset of how can we live and coexist together mutually. Eco-sexuality also looks at the biopsychosocial model of how things are interacting. So it's saying that things like your biology contributes to your sexuality, as well as your psychology, as well as the society and culture that you're in. And so it's really broadening our perspective of sexuality to not look so narrowly, but ask us to kind of outstretch ourselves. And this work, the biopsychosocial model, was invented in 1977. So this is well before the onset or the coinage of eco-sexuality by Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle. But it really loops in this intersectionality in a very holistic way. And again, I use this term intersectionality. It's coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, just to give some credit here to this amazing scholar. And she was really looking at feminist theory and politics, but I think it's so applicable to sex and sexuality as a whole. So ecosexuality is looking at things that we wouldn't normally connect, right? The environment and sex, even though the sex is happening in the environment the whole time. And this was another key for me in my journey to self-worth and wholeness and deep connection, is that I realized that everything in all of the universe is having sex with itself, you know? So even the cells inside our being are multiplying and dividing, and even being pulled away from something is actually being pulled towards something else. So there's always this relationship, this intimate dynamic of reproduction happening. And in nature, sex is not shameful. It is just a part of life. And we think back to our ancestors in ancient times, sex, again, was not shameful. It was just a part of life, and not only just a part of life, it was this beautiful spiritual part of life. So our modern world is very disconnected, and I think this is part of what we have come to in society is we have lost our connection to the wild. We have lost our idea of the wildness in ourselves. So we have a hard time. We want to be in boxes, and we have a hard time being okay with our own hypocrisy. That I can be a spiritual being and I can be a sexual being. That I can love sugar, but also want to live a holistic life. So the contradictions within our internal world, I think, is what makes us wild. And we cannot have the contradictions because we want to fit into these nice, neat boxes. So our world disconnects from certain aspects of self so that we can fit into those boxes. And our world values convenience over quality. The biohacking, hacking our nature as if we needed to biohack, instead of taking this longer, more explorative road. We just want those quick fixes. And I think of pharmaceuticals when I think of biohacking and kind of just like quick fix. We value rigidity over change. Again, those boxes. Our world values knowledge over wisdom. And what I mean is we go to school and get all of this knowledge, but where is the internal wisdom that we have in our hearts? And really utilizing and integrating the knowledge that we have to live our best life, to be led from an internal aspect that drives us forward, an internal curiosity of exploration. And our world values restrictions over pleasure. So going on all of those, like those diets and then having your cheat day is like a bad thing. It's a cheat day. You know, even the rhetoric around that is restrictive. So these are just some aspects that I see in our world. And I think eco-sexuality is one way that we can begin to rewire our values and ask ourselves what we really want to put virtue into. Speaking of boxes and rigidity, I think about sex and gender. So here you can see this person and the way that we express is going to be very different. So there's a gender identity, a sexual orientation, our biology, our expression, our romantic orientation, and these are all very different aspects of our sexuality. So for me, I was assigned female at birth. I present very feminine. My gender identity is cisgender, but my sexual orientation is queer or ecosexual. And queer to me is just this, it's odd, it's nuanced, it's a little strange. At least that's the way I defined it. And so I define myself as sexually queer or an ecosexual orientation. And then my romantic orientation, I love men and I love women. I am romantically involved with many different people. I see many different things as lovers. And while we all have our own dynamics and our own unique relationships, I still have a lot of love for many different people and many different types of people. I put this alongside the flowering plant diagram here just to see that the stamen and the pistil are what we would in science say the male and the female reproductive parts. And so I just love this because it's kind of a mirror of ecosexuality, that when we have our biology, when it comes to humans, we have males and females, but there's also this third biology called intersex. And actually 1.7% of people on the globe are born intersex. And this is somebody who has kind of like both parts. And unfortunately, these people typically experience some kind of surgical procedure almost immediately after birth that eventually causes a lot of confusion. But we can also see here mirrored in nature that there are many, many species that have both the male and female reproductive parts, and that this is actually super special. And Native Americans actually called these folks two-spirit, having both the feminine and the masculine spirit in one. And they held the torch for the rest of society and led the way in understanding the dynamics between the feminine and masculine energies. So this is one way that ecosexuality may help us deconstruct our ideas of sex. And with that diagram on the last slide, you see that there are a bunch of labels. And I just have this here to say that language is very limiting, especially in the English dialect. And I want to encourage you to create definitions for yourself of what you want your sex and your sexuality to look like, which we're going to do a little bit more here in a moment. So ecosexuality is one lens that I use to look through the world. You do not have to claim it as an orientation if you do not want to, but it is one pair of glasses we can put on when we want and maybe view the world in a different way. It is an art form. It is stewardship. It is sustainability. It is activism. It is strange and weird and asks us to look at the world in a new perspective. something that I love about eco-sexuality, but that I really want to emphasize in my work that I don't think gets emphasized enough in the original dichotomy of eco-sexuality, is this idea of sex versus sense. And sexuality, eco-sexuality, still has this very pornographic essence to it. And that is only because of the way that our society has defined sex. But I want to add in this layer of sensuality. And that is, I think so many beautiful people are doing this work of reclaiming the senses. And that's why eco-sexuality is a spectrum, just like so many other things in life. We don't have to fit in these boxes. Sure, we can go masturbate in nature. We can rub warm rocks against our body and experience all of the pleasure of a waterfall hitting our genitals. And it is beautiful and it is sexy. And eco-sexuality is also just feeling the breeze against your skin on a hot day. It is the feeling of floating in the water. This is sex. This is sensation. And it calls us back into enlivening our senses, reclaiming the feminine, reclaiming our emotion, reclaiming the sensitivity of what it means to be a being here on this globe and on this world. And you can see a couple images here. I've got Ron Jeremy, famous porn star, and there's nothing wrong with porn. But what porn has done has made it performative. Sexuality has become performative instead of just a beautiful sensual experience. And so I have these pictures of dancers here. One we see is very performative. Lots of people like going to watch, where as this other dancer is just getting down, just like headphones on, just ready to dance for the pleasure of their own dancing. And so we are being called back into that sensing of our ancestors, the eros of our ancestors, a return to the wild, a re-evaluation of what it means to be wild, internally and externally. Sorry about the barking. And one thing I love about the concept of eros, which is so pivotal to this sensation, of the refolding in sensation, is the story of Eros in Greek mythology. And it is said that there were primordial gods that were gifted to the earth. And one was Eros and one was Chaos. And Eros was the god of love and sex and sensuality. Really these like indulgences. Eros was indulgent and sexy. And Chaos was wild and deeply feeling and had a lot of emotion, and it is that sensitive part. And so you cannot separate the sexual from the sensual. They are one and the same, but we have in society separated them so far that for the intentions of being able to control a power that is well beyond a power that is anything that we could ever contain. Sexuality is power, and that is why they want to control sexuality. Whoever you want to put they to, because they know that sex is an important part of life, and to not have access to it would mean the end of a society as we know it, would mean the end of being as we know it. And that is why sex has become okay only in certain contexts, only in marriage, only with a man and a woman, only with penetration. There's there's context to sexuality and to what it can be and what it cannot be. And that is because they know that they have to provide a little taste of power so that we feel like we are in power. If they didn't dole out little drops of power, then there would be revolution. And so this quote from Uses of the Erotic by Audre Lorde, I love, and kind of goes back to that story, the Greek mythology. The erotic is a measure between the beginnings of our sense of self and the chaos of our strongest feelings. And I love this because this is what the erotic is. This is eroticism. Eroticism is the animation of life itself. And this is why I say that eco-sexuality, or what I have, I've been building out my own framework called erotic ecology. The framework of this beckons us back to that ancestral time where we knew all things were connected, where we knew spirit was in all things. And so this is where you get to define sexuality for yourself. You can see that the erotic is the thing that animates life. It is intimacy with all of life. And sex is certainly a part of the erotic, but it is only a small part of what is erotic. So I want you to think back to those definitions of what is sex, who is sex for, what is sex for, and I want you to begin to question if those definitions or those ideas fit the way that you want to live in life, or are they layered with shame and with stigma to keep you smaller than who you are? These are some questions you may want to ask yourself. Where do your stories come from? Who do you hear in your head when you tell yourself that story? How do these stories feel? Do they feel joyful and happy? Do they feel shame and of guilt? In what ways do you perpetuate these stories? This one's hard because it means you have to take ownership of the way you have conducted your life. Who would I be without these stories? How might pleasure shift? And we have to know that the erotic, this true intimacy with life, when we are in tune, it is absolutely fearless. There is no shame that can get in our way because we are fully in alignment with our erotic self, with the erotic essence of life. Eroticism is wise. And so when we are connected to our own wisdom, we don't need other people to tell us any knowledge. It is something that we find within ourselves. It is our own inner compass. And it prevents us from settling because when we are fully aligned with our wisdom, we know what is a hell yes and what is a hell no. It is an act against oppression and it is empowering from within. And so I want you to write a new sexual story. I want you to think about how eco-sexuality might be one potential avenue, whether you adopt it or not, just for the exercise of this moment. What would eco-sexuality look like for you? How might you already live an eco-sexual life? How might your existence change as an eco-sexual? Where would you land in the spectrum of eco-sexuality? How do you want to show up sensually in your life? What types of connections do you want to have? And what do you want to create in the world? Because again, sex is that creative life force. It is eros. It is animating. So I'm not going to speak too much more, but I'm going to leave you with 5 keys to a fulfilling sensual life. And I want you to see if the life that you live in your sexual life right now is in alignment with these 5 qualities, or if there's something that you can shift in this moment. And key number 1 is service. How are you showing up in service to the world? How are you showing up in service to your partner? How are you showing up in service to yourself? And so this looks like foreplay. This looks like personal pleasure and masturbation. This looks like quality time with yourself, things that you love to do, things that bring you joy. How are you showing up in service to yourself, to your partners, and to the world? Alignment. Are you in line with your erotic self? Are you in alignment with your desires? I could talk about desire all day long, but what you desire most also desires you. But if you are not living in a life that is in alignment with those desires and working towards those desires, you are not going to live a fulfilling sensual life. And again, when I'm saying sensual life, I am talking about the bedroom. I am talking about sex, and I'm talking about so much more. Because when I realized that my sexual life is just but one component and a reflection of how I live my greater life, I realized there was so much more for me, and there was so much more I could do and access. Key number 5, feeling of progress. So I think that there's some kind of quote that if you're not growing, then you're dying. So what I want you to do is look at how you're progressing in your sexual life. So are you doing something edgy? Are you having hard conversations? Maybe there's something that you try. Even if you don't like it, I want you to begin to experiment and edge yourself towards something new. Because if you're not learning about your sex and sexuality, you're not going to be able to really dive into who you are and what you like. If you have thought your whole life that you wouldn't like plums and never tried a plum, how would you know? So just getting curious and getting out there and exploring. Key number 4, love and connection. So what relationships are you nurturing? How are you nurturing them? I believe that your sexual experience begins outside the bedroom. So how are you spending time with your partners and with yourself outside of your sexual experience? Are you spending quality time off of your phones with your lovers, with yourself? Are you able to be in tune with yourself and your relationships? And finally, key number 5, a supportive environment. So is your bedroom sexy? Is it beautiful? Is it comfortable? Is it inviting? Does it make you want to have a sexual experience, or is it uninspiring? Does it feel cold? Does it feel cluttered? What is the environment that you move through, the environment that you cultivate moving into sexy time? So by this I mean, when you're going all day with all the stressors, how are you shifting into sexy time? Are you just going right in and being productive and trying to make a quick fix, and then wondering why you're feeling unfulfilled and your relationship sucks? Make that shift into sexy time, beautiful and indulgent and rich. And also, who's in your community? Who can you talk to about your sex life? Who can you, are the lovers that you are taking, are they open to trying new things with you? Are you open to trying new things with them? Even though they might be scary or threatening or kind of weird, think about the environment that you're putting yourself in and seek out ways that you can find a more supportive environment. So, again, we're wrapping up here, but I just want to say that erotic ecology is the framework that I've built out for myself and for my clients, to get us deeper into our connections with self, lover, and earth. And I use herbalism, sensate-focused sex therapy, a reclamation of desire and of the feminine, sustainability practices and environmentalism and interconnectedness, all to inform this framework. We're not going to have time for a meditation today, but I want to thank you all so much for sticking through all this information. I really hope you got something out of it. I will let you know that I have a workshop series coming up called Botanical Lover. And this is our curriculum. We're going to go into some what we went through today was very like meta and theoretical. So in Botanical Lover, we're going to get down and dirty into herbalism, some neuroscience, and some actual tangible plants that you might want to use for your pleasurable experience. We're also going to talk about consent and communication with lovers. We'll talk about kink and BDSM. We're talking about eco-fetishism and how to play with plants. And it's going to be so juicy. So upon this recording, you're going to get also a discount code for joining and for participating in this webinar. Wow. It has been so lovely to spend time with you. I hope you got a really juicy experience here, and I look forward to spending more time with you soon. Stay sexy, y'all.